David Wright, Secretary General of IOSCO, thank you very much indeed for joining us. To what extent is that as a consequence of industry failing to internalise its responsibilities for what happened?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for that. We can heap blame all round for what's happened. I think it's primarily a failure of the industry. This is an industry of immense sophistication, we were told, but clearly an industry and parts of the industry and certain banks who simply didn't manage their risk properly or understand those risks, and their boards didn't understand the risks. And those were the banks that went to the wall. The regulators didn't understand the risk in the system either. Let's not forget the IMF was telling us in 2007 that never had the world better distributed risk in the financial system. And a few months later, it blew up big time. So, there's two arguments about this crisis, where it originated. One is the macro imbalances, which Jacques Larosière, my good friend, would argue. I think that it was more of a micro economic origins. In other words, if you sell trillions of dollars of mortgages to people who can never pay them back, you're heading for big trouble. So complex primary fault with the industry. The regulators certainly have a big share of not having done their job properly.
But we've also got a situation where we've got global capital markets, but national regulatory design. To what extent, basically, not just in terms of having caused the crisis, but the failure to deal with the crisis is a consequence of the lack of some sort of binding arbitration?
Well, this is something I talk about a lot. I think that if we believe in global capital markets, which I do, and I think global capital markets can be a tremendous force for good in the world. It can spread capital, it can enrich economies. You can't develop an economy unless you have a capital market. If you're in Africa and you're a poor country, you simply have to have a capital market in order to develop into the medium and long term. So this can be a tremendous force for good. But unless we have institutions at the global level which can ensure that good standards are being applied, then I worry. Because then it's what the French would call chacun pour soi, everybody for themselves. So right now, the global financial system and its regulators, or its regulatory bodies, have three tools in which to ensure implementation of our principles. The first one is color diagrams. The second one is peer pressure, and the third one is prayer, and prayer is probably the strongest of the three. We have no binding institutions, we have no binding dispute settlement system like the WTO, and the problem today is just about manageable, because we have really two big jurisdictions, the EU and the US. Everybody else is caught between those two big institutions, but in 10 or 20 years' time, we're going to have many, many more big capital markets. So what is everybody going to do? Just apply the rules as they see fit? Because that is a recipe for fragmentation. So I believe in the end, logic takes you towards institutions. You can't run Australia or any economy without institutions. You can't run the European Union without institutions. And neither do I think you can really build a global capital market which is properly regulated without institutions. And we can sort of say, oh, it's all difficult, national politics, sovereignty, fine, in which case you're going to get a suboptimal global capital market.
We might also be looking towards the development of regional markets if one can't necessarily do it at an international level, precisely because you've got these disputes between the European Union and the Americans. But what we're also seeing is even within IOSCO, leadership of IOSCO transfers to Brazil later this year. The Brazilian market is growing exponentially. Stephen King from HSBC talks about the emergence of a new global south, a turbocharged southern Silk Route. It's conceivably possible that what we're going to see is regionalization, the development of regional capital markets, precisely because London and New York cannot be trusted.
That could happen. That could happen. And I think it would be better than just purely national markets. It could be an interim step. Of course, you have the European Union, you have, if you like, the Americas, the United States. But I think in the end, again, I don't think that's sufficient, because you will have a bloc, let us say, in Latin America, who will say, well, here's our rules on the application of Basel, the Basel Agreement, or here are our rules on derivatives. If you want to do business with us, just follow our rules. So everybody in that scenario can have their own equivalence or substituted compliance arrangements. And so you get into a very complex matrix where 8 or 10 big jurisdictions or blocks or start to have to negotiate with each other about whether their regimes are equivalent or not. That doesn't make sense. Actually, what you really want is a common set of rules at the global level which have some level of enforcement, but only at the, if you like, dealing with the key prudential issues. We don't need to worry about, in a way, how the Brazilians or the Australians or anybody else apply their consumer rules. That's a national prerogative. But we're talking here about the systemic issues. Those have to be, in my view, regulated at the global level and applied and implemented at the global level.
And who's going to do the enforcement?
Well, I think you have to have some system here of dispute settlement system, and that's the difficult piece, Justin, and that's why I probably need your help.
That's why I asked it.
That's why I need your help. What are the sanctions in that system? That's very difficult. I don't pretend to have all the answers to that, but we have to think about it. Because let us think that a country or a region deliberately does not apply a series of rules properly in order to gain competitive advantage. What are you going to do? Are you just going to let business go on and business gets sucked away on an unfair basis, unfair competitive basis? Or are you going to be able, as a global community, to be able to apply measures, even sanctions, which will force that jurisdiction to comply? That's a very difficult question, but we have to think about how we do that.
And it will only happen if there is commitment by industry as well as regulators to the actual overarching regulatory framework, which in turn is linked to the purpose. What is the purpose of the capital markets? The purpose of the capital markets is to allocate capital effectively, efficiently, and fairly.
Correct. And I'll tell you one thing about the sort of vision I have, which is it's actually much more democratic. If you have a complex global system where everybody does what they want, that favors the big multinational CIFRs, the big players, because they can navigate with expensive lawyers and accountants and auditors around the system. The small companies can't. So the system I'm putting forward is much more pro-competitive and much more democratic. So if a small jurisdiction feels that it's applied the rules correctly, but sees its business being siphoned off by a jurisdiction who has not applied the rules correctly, it can do something about it. At the moment, it can do absolutely nothing.
So peer pressure can be made substantive.
Peer pressure, in my view, gets you so far, but it doesn't force a change of rules. Governments can simply... And you know, the problem is not small jurisdictions in the Caribbean. We're not talking about that. We're talking about when a big jurisdiction or a major market does not apply the rules properly. And there are shifts of business, anti-competitive shifts of business. Then what?
Well, we began this interview talking about whether or not banking or the capital markets were facing an existential crisis. I suppose in a way, this reform agenda that you're now proposing can only be made real if there is a further existential crisis.
Well, you hope not, Justin. You hope that what I would appeal to the leaders and the regulators of the world is to think not about next week, but about what sort of system do we want and what sort of system will we need in 10, 15, 20 years. And not enough of that thinking is being done. People say, oh, it's all too difficult. Yeah, it's difficult. Building the Bretton Woods institutions after the Second World War was difficult. But what was provided then was great leadership by a number of countries. And actually that's what we need now. Because, again, my view, and I don't think it's idealistic, my view is that if you really want the free movement of capital, financial services, you're going to have institutions which can, in the end, guarantee that. Otherwise, you will inevitably have ring fencing, different rules, play by my games, play by my rules, or you don't do business. Everybody can do that. China can do that. Brazil can do that. India can do that. Everybody can do the same. And what's the result is what I said earlier, it's fragmentation. Fragmentation of markets, which is a suboptimal outcome in terms of economic welfare at the global level. So I just appeal to people to think to the future and think what type of institutions we need for global capitalism to work. And I don't think it will work with the institutions that we have today. It can't.
David Wright, thank you very much.